I don't think about them every day. All I see is the one interview on ABC, and we make judgments based on that, which is unfortunate. It makes it really hard and volatile for brands to keep that strong reputation and make people understand or see all the amazing things that you do. And I think, I don't have an answer to that challenge, but as communicators and media advisors going forward, we have to think, how do we get cut through?
It's the stuff of media advisor nightmares. You receive a call from the producer of a renowned investigative journalism team requesting an interview with the CEO. Enter the double-edged sword. Perform well, and this is a golden opportunity to provide context and information to your stakeholders. Perform poorly, and it's a PR disaster in waiting. The recent Four Corners episode exploring Australia's supermarket duopoly provided us with such a case study. Coles CEO Leah Weckert was calm and collected, answering the queries she was aware of and taking new information on notice. Woolworths CEO Brad Banducci was not, and it culminated in his resignation in the very same week. Today on What's at Stake, we explore the X's and O's of media interviews, their opportunities, their possibilities, and possible outcomes. And joining me to do so are two of Banksia Strategic Partners' savviest media performers, Director James Fitzpatrick and Communications Associate Matilda Finn. Thank you for your time today, team. So let's start with the preparation for such a media event. Matilda, in a former life, you too were a journalist of high repute. What does a journalistic team want from such a style of interview like we saw in Four Corners?
I think if I was preparing for an interview like this, I'd want to be as prepared as possible before I walk in there. So I'd want to have all the special cards up my sleeve. I'd want to have all those case studies where, why is this person feeling these temperatures in this warehouse? Explain what this means, because they're not going to have the details of that. I want them to feel a little bit like they're sweating. You want to have questions that are going to push them. You want to have questions that aren't going to be the kind of ones that they can just respond to with a prep that they've done with their media advisor prior. And you want to keep pushing them. So if you hear them give an answer that's a bit long-winded, you can tell they're trying to avoid the question, you just keep pushing and you keep going and going. And for a video interview, you're just trying to get the spiciest grab possible that you can use, like ABC did in their social media advertising before Four Corners dropped on Monday night. And you want to have, when he walked out of the interview, that was absolute goldmine for a producer. If I was watching behind the screen, I'd be like, we've got him.
Sorry, I can't accept that. Rod Sims, the former head of the ACCC, says that we have one of the most concentrated supermarkets in the world. Is he lying?
It's not true.
His words are that
Retired, by the way.
I don't think you would impugn his integrity and his understanding of competition law.
I'm just saying the world has got much more competitive since the terrific initiatives that were put in place back in whatever it was, 2008-9.
He retired 18 months ago. He's not...
Okay, can we take that out? Is that okay?
Sorry, let's just keep going.
Are we going to...
Sorry, what are you unhappy with?
I shouldn't have said that about Rod about him being retired.
Well, you did say it.
Yeah,
and
I mean, he is retired, but I shouldn't have said that, Angus. Are we going to leave it in there if we are?
Well, I mean, we're on the record. Okay. You said it. I mean, let's move on. But
yeah, no, I think I'm done, guys. I do this with good intent. I don't do this with bad intent. No.
You're walking out, really?
No. Can we just talk to Brad for a second?
Let me just.
Can we just have a minute? Let's pause. We'll be finished in seconds.
That is such an exciting thing to see happen in an interview like that, and just the incredulity on his face when he was like, "You're walking off," really, it really hit home the kind of situation that was unfolding. It was awful for the media advisors from Woolies, but it was fantastic for Four Corners.
And to follow up on that, how much of a difference is there between a good fact-finding mission and a good story? Would that episode be as impactful for Four Corners and the journalist team if there wasn't the walkout? If there was two very calm CEOs, does that still maintain that it's a good story, or do you need, I suppose, that character development to actually kind of create an exciting piece of media for both the journalism team but also the consumer?
It's very rare as well for Four Corners to advertise the way they did so heavily ahead of dropping an episode. Usually you kind of get a bit of a preempt of, we're doing this story on Monday night. But releasing an extended clip from the show like that was such clever advertising. I think even you and I were talking about this last week. The stories that they kind of found or uncovered, going to the winery, saying this isn't produced at this at this winery, wasn't really that. And it wasn't great investigative journalism. But when it's presented to a CEO who's so unprepared like that, it just combined in the perfect media kind of circus for ABC, and they just ran with it.
Can I ask, as a media advisor myself, I often try and encourage executives or CEOs before they go into an interview to put themselves in the shoes of the journalist. Can I ask to you in your former life as a journalist, did you go into those interviews knowing what line you think the CEO, the executive's going to use or going to take? Or is it very much like open-ended, you have no idea where the interview could go?
Yeah, I mean, I think every interview is different, but when you're interviewing someone who's a CEO of a major company like Woolworths, I think, it's such a topical issue. We're talking about cost of living, we're talking about supply issues, which I think the media advisors and the PR advisors, they knew those questions were coming. In knowing that, the journalist would think, I know what he's going to say, therefore I'm going to keep rewording my question to try and get a different answer out of him. That's what I would do personally. I would keep pushing it. And I can imagine, bear in mind, that interview could have gone for an hour and we've got a 45-minute episode or even less on Four Corners. They're only going to use maybe 6 minutes, 7 minutes of footage all up from Brad Banducci. So the rest of it could have been a perfectly normal interview and the journalist just kept pushing and tried to get a response out of him. And I also think the way that, when he made that famous comment about, the former ACCC chair, Rod Sims, is retired. And then the journalist came back and said, well, retiring 18 months ago is not that long ago. And then made this comment, I don't think you'd impugn his integrity with that remark. He kept pushing, and that's when Brad started to sweat and started to panic, and that's when he wanted to walk out because he realised his mistake because the journalist kept going and he knew that he'd found something spectacular for cameras.
Yeah, he's pushed on a pain point. Can I just pull out one point there, because I think it's a really important lesson for executives and spokespeople and media advisors, is that Matilda just said something that we've seen a lot of in interviews, is that journalists will keep asking the same question and they might dress it up in different ways, shapes or forms if they haven't got the answer that they're looking for, but they'll keep asking it. And something that is important for spokespeople to remember is you can keep giving the same answer. So if you've got an answer that you're comfortable and confident in to that question, just keep delivering the same thing, even if the question comes at you in different shapes and sizes and forms. It'll seem unnatural because it'll seem repetitive. And it's a term that we've used around the office a fair bit. It's called the vomit principle, which is you say the same thing so many times over and over again that it makes you feel like you're going to vomit. But ultimately, the journalists, then they're not going to clip that up and use the same answer over and over again. They'll just use it once. So to you, it seems repetitive and boring, but to the end product, the end outcome, they're only going to play that once, and you've stuck to your key messages rather than trying to come up with a new answer for what is essentially the same question.
Yeah, and the journalists will get bored. If they keep asking the same question 3 or 4 times, they're going to realise, I've only got a certain amount of time I can spend with this person. I'm going to have to move on to the next topic. They're going to get sick of asking the same thing over and over again. And I think we saw a very different case when you saw the Coles CEO, Leah Weckert. She was giving the same answer every single time, and it was perfectly calm and monotone. And you could even see the journalist kind of getting frustrated because he was like, I'm not getting what I want out of her, so I'm just going to move on.
So you have an email from one supplier. We have over 8,000 suppliers that we work with. We have a team of people whose job it is to look to validate cost price increases, and we take that job very seriously.
He says that's the definition of price gouging. Is that the case?
We don't engage in practices like that.
So you're saying absolutely that this is not a practice that you engage in to use a price increase to increase your margin or your bottom line in another way?
I would need to see the specifics of any particular scenario to judge whether it's reasonable or not. What we have certainly seen is that there has been inflation in cost bases. Coles has not been immune to that. The increases have been substantial over the last couple of years, and so some of that does flow through to the consumer.
So it was 2 very different interviews, and I think the issue was that Brad kind of took the bait and really lent into his own kind of personal remarks and then really went off course. But I think the journalists will get bored, so just keep saying the same answer.
So a question for you now, James, is if you're presuming in this situation that there's going to be some, I suppose, hostile intent from the journalism team, like they're looking for a gotcha moment, is it okay to decline the interview and say, like, I know what the comment from Brad was, I've come here with good intent, but you know that they're coming here with what he would describe as bad intent. Is it ever okay to decline? Or if you do accept the invitation, what are you trying to get out of it if you are going to, take the vomit theory or play deadpan or, how do you navigate this situation to make it best for you and your company and your organisation?
It's a really good question. There will be times where it is appropriate to decline. Like there might be legal considerations, or they might be asking you questions that are outside of your scope that aren't relevant to your organisation, or where they just want you to throw someone else under the bus, like the government or the ACCC. And that's why it's so important. Like if a journalist comes to your media team or to you as a spokesperson, that you understand before you agree to it what the questions are going to be. Now, journalists might not ask those exact questions, but they're normally pretty honest about the topics that they're going to ask. So there will be times where it is appropriate to decline, but most of the time we would recommend that you do consider getting involved in an interview if it falls within your space and your remit, because if you don't, then you lose an opportunity to have your side of the story in the narrative. And I think even if it's going to be hostile, if you've got wind of the fact that Four Corners or ABC are probably going down a particular path, or they've got a particular objective in this interview, then it's still important that you get your messages out there, but you've got to be really prepared. And one of the key things, and you've sort of alluded to this in your question, Gordon, is that acknowledge that the journalist has an objective in that interview. Well, you also need to have an objective then. So you don't just, as an organisation or a spokesperson, you don't just agree to an interview for the sake of it. Yes, the Fourth Estate's great. Yes, we've got to do our part for journalism. But from an organisation's point of view, what do you want to get out of that interview? What is your end objective? And it's got to be thinking about your customers, your stakeholders. What message are you trying to get through to them? And how are you going to use this interview to get that message through to them? So that's number one. And then the second thing is, okay, you've got that objective in mind. Well, how are you going to take control of the interview? Because journalists, and they'll come to you and they'll say, let's do the interview at this time, at this date. We'll ask all of these questions and we'll decide the environment. No, you've got to be in control. You go back to the journalist and say, we're going to do it at this time. These are the topics that our spokesperson will talk to. He or she won't talk to these other areas because it's outside of our scope. This is where we're going to do it. And I think Woolies, you've seen them do it quite often. They do choose to do it in store, and they do choose to do it with the relaxed branding and having the Woolies polo on. And I think most of the time that's fine. Like that works. You've got to take that into consideration. And it looks like they have taken control of the environment there. But those are the type of things that you need to factor in. When you say yes to an interview, then you push back and you decide the parameters. You decide the scope, you decide the topics, you decide the timing. So suddenly, rather than the journalist being in control, you're in control, you're the one setting the rules, and you're thinking about your objective. What was your objective in joining that interview?
So the trending moment from the Four Corners episode was, of course, Brad Banducci's walkout after he dismissed the opinion of the former ACCC chair, Rod Sims, saying it was out of date, and then he got that probably factually incorrect, and then started to stumble, and the deck of cards started to tumble. The question from around the office, Tilly, was like, did the journalist lay a trap? Do you think that the prodding of that moment was in good faith, or do you think there was a trap laid?
I don't know if it was necessarily a trap. I think he stumbled across a trap that he didn't realise was going to play out on a camera. I think, I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but we were talking about the differences between off the record, on the record, and on background, like last week in the office. I think if you know you're sitting down for a Four Corners interview and it's all on camera, you need to assume, unless it's clearly stated at the start, everything you say is going to be on the record. So when he tried to backtrack and say, I want to cut that out, you're not in control of the content. The producers are, the journalist is, unless it's agreed to prior that, there can be moments where I'm allowed to cut out something I've said. The moment you've said it, and like the journalist says, it's on the record, we're just going to have to move on. You've already done that. So I think what was really interesting is I don't think it was necessarily a preemptive trap that they were laying. If they chose to do it in the store, if they chose to have the Woolies polo on, and that was all their decision. But in terms of when that all started to unfold, I think, if anything, the Woolies team kind of brought a trap on themselves. Having the media advisor come over and tap the journalist on the shoulder is completely inappropriate. So everything that unfolded, I don't think was planned. I think it was just this opportune moment for the ABC to go, oh my God, we've got him. We've really made him sweat. Most people understand sort of trivially in the public what off the record and on the record means. On background is a little bit more nuanced. It's more to preempt some stories. A lot of media advisors will use it when they want to kind of give some context to a story, but they're not an official spokesperson. So they might call a journo and say, I can give you some on-background information for a story you might want to do in a couple of weeks and to let you know the ball's rolling behind the scenes, and then we can come back to you at a later date. That's kind of what on-background means. But I think usually when you start any interview with someone, you need to say, all right, you've got 3 different sort of things you can pull on here. You can tell me what is on the record and we can start that conversation now. If you want something off the record, you have to explicitly say to me before you say it, this is going to be off the record. This is just some information for your piece. Now, if you're sitting down I don't know what was said, and I don't think anyone's going to know unless you're a producer from Four Corners. We don't know what was said to Brad Banducci or the CEO of Coles before they sat down. I can assume if you're sitting in front of a camera, you need to assume everything's on the record. The moment he said, can I remove that? He just dug a hole for himself. So I think there's a little bit of ambiguity around, I think we talked about that as soon as it dropped, Gordon and I, about what was said to him before he sat down for the interview that he thought he could say, can I cut that out of the piece? That's so rare on not live TV, but on a piece like that for them to say, can I take out what I just said? That is so rare to see and then be used on camera, because usually you're told at the start, this is all on the record and you have to just accept whatever you say is going to be used. And the journalists can do, and the producers can use it however they see fit. You have no control once it's on camera. Mm.
And so from a coaching point of view, to flip back to the interviewee, how would you approach that situation? So first off, he's trying to criticize some information presented to him by the journalist. How would you suggest that's a good technique, or is it a different technique you would use? And if you do stumble, make a mistake, or make a real mistake, like you probably did, and you want to retract something, how do you do that in a fashion that doesn't result in, you asking to stop the interview or walking out?
To answer the first part of your question, if you think the journalist is putting forward, or the premise of their question is based on an incorrect assumption or something that's just not factual, then absolutely, call that out and say, no, that's not right. What is correct is X, Y, Z, or your facts are correct, but your conclusion is not, and then explain why not. So yes, you can absolutely pull apart the question and criticise the question if you're confident in the facts from your side, and you should do that to correct the spread of misinformation. The second part then, if you do come across a trap, or if you do end up in what we could call a spicy situation, then to Matilda's point earlier, it is in the record, so you're going to have to live with that. But what I would recommend in that situation is, you've said something you shouldn't have said, okay, well, straight away apologise for it. There are circumstances where if it's a pre-record, which was the case for this interview, you can just stop and say, oh, sorry, can we redo that bit again? If the journalist is like, no, that was really good content, I'm going to keep it, okay. All right, well, I'm going to immediately apologise and take back what I just said. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That was improper of me. Move on to the next question. Because then suddenly if the journalist uses that bit, it's like, well, but actually I immediately took it back and I apologised and I admitted and took responsibility for the fact that that was an inappropriate thing to say. Well, suddenly you've got no story anymore because people make mistakes all the time. They say the wrong thing. But if you acknowledge that you've said the wrong thing and immediately take responsibility for it and apologise for it, well, suddenly you've taken all the air out of the story. And I think the journalist is probably less likely to then use it because they know you've immediately responded to it. But even if they do, you've set the context and you've already deflated the story. So that's how I would respond in that situation. And I think that goes back to something that I will always tell spokespeople going into any interview, particularly if you think there's going to be some hostile questions. Don't get involved in the back and forth. Never get hostile. Never threaten to walk out of an interview because that is just great footage. If you disagree with the questioning, if you're getting angry at the journalist, just go back to that initial objective. Why are you there? You are there, you're not talking to the journalist. You're talking to the people at home. You're talking to your customers sitting on the couch watching Four Corners at night. Think about them. Yes, you might be getting emotional and angry at that journalist for asking particular questions, but they're just doing their job. Do not get hostile. Just accept the fact that you're there with a particular objective to talk to your customers.
And so in this situation, as a viewer, I thought Brad's point may have had merit until he wants to stop, retract it, and then walks out. Because his comment was that Rod Sims has been retired for 18 months. And if you extrapolate that, well then like that is a long time in these unprecedented times that we live in, and everything is changing quite rapidly. So when you said like don't get involved in the back and forth, if he had stopped, maybe collected himself and just said, well, I acknowledge that, 18 months isn't a long time, but actually I think a lot of things have changed. Is that an appropriate strategy, or would you prefer him just accept the comment from the journalist and try and move on to a different talking point?
Probably the latter. Like, yes, you could call out Rod Sims, but it's a dangerous path to go down. Like, it also seems overly colloquial, and the way that he approached it, and that's one of the issues with his Woolworths interview, I think, is the way that they came across in the interview was too relaxed and not perhaps acknowledging the current brand issue or attribution of responsibility that Woolworths have got at the moment, that their customers are doing it tough. This is serious, and they feel like Woolworths and Coles are probably in the wrong. I feel like you've got to acknowledge that. And if you're coming across as a CEO as, dismissing claims by Rod Sims, even if he is retired, it feels like to the customer that perhaps you're not taking this as seriously as you could, and like as if you're coming across that you're above questioning, and Australians don't like that. Australians, in my experience, the majority want to see leaders be humble and show that they are connected with the everyday consumer, that they do understand the cost of living. And if you're just dismissing claims, or if you're coming across like you're above questioning, then that is not going to land well, and that it's going to damage your brand even further. So to go back to your initial question, Gordon, in that context of that current brand attribution of responsibility, I think it's probably not appropriate to try and have a crack at Rod Sims and seem overly dismissive of claims by Rod Sims. I would actually be taking it much more serious and in a much more corporate, serious response, which I think we saw the Coles CEO do really well.
You could tell how ill-prepared he was for the interview because he interjected several times with the journalist, and that is a big no-no. You need to allow yourself and your brain time to absorb what the question is and go, okay, how can I answer this in line with the objectives that I've already set out before coming to this interview? And we know that Coles and Woolies are facing massive brand reputation risk at the moment. And so you know what kind of environment you're walking into that with. And I think also making a comment that, the former ACCC chair is retired and that was 18 months ago. Well, by the same brushstroke, Brad Banducci was there for 9 years, and people would argue that, well, the actual market in Australia and the market share environment has drastically changed. So maybe people could say that he wasn't qualified to talk about the issues that he was talking about. Never bring your personal opinions into an interview like that. That was the first thought I had when he made that retired comment. I was like, that is nothing to do with the Woolies brand. That is clearly your personal feelings on the matter, and that should never, particularly as a spokesperson for a massive organisation, be brought into an interview like that.
So then my last kind of strategy question is around who do you put up for the interview? And so obviously I think Coles had an easy choice because Leah Weckert is obviously a well-trained media performer. She absolutely nailed the interview, and everyone's come out not talking about Coles at all, which I think is probably their objective. On the flip side, does Woolworths have to present Brad because he is the CEO? Or if you know that he has a combative streak or doesn't come across telegenically or any other kind of criticisms to his media performance, would it be appropriate to put forward the marketing officer, the operating officer, or someone else who is high enough but not the CEO?
Absolutely. Like horses for courses. And that's where, as a media team, you need to go through this strategy beforehand. And I suspect that they probably did. But what I would recommend to organisations before going into an interview like this is follow, and it's a well-known crisis communication theory. It's called situational crisis communication theory by Tim Coombs. And basically it's a matrix or a formula for organisations to follow to understand what the attribution of responsibility is to their organisation right now before you go into an interview and before you respond. And it encourages you to ask some questions like, even if technically we're not in the wrong on this topic, and Woolworths and Coles they've definitely not done anything illegal. They've run for-profit companies yes, a duopoly has been created, but, is that really their fault? And that's a whole nother debate for another podcast and the merits of capitalism, but we won't get into that today. Even if technically they're not at fault, what attribution of responsibility did your customers hold to you? Do they hold you responsible regardless of that technical fault? And those are the types of questions you need to start to ask yourself. And then the second part is, okay, and what's the broader context? Have there been media stories on this topic lately? Has our brand suffered damage recently? And we looked to the Woolworths Australia Day crisis, where they probably mixed that up a little bit and came across as not as honest as they could have been in some of their decision-making process around the decision not to sell Australia Day knickknacks. And what's the broader media context at the moment? What's their current brand reputation like? And you think immediately to the cost of living, like everyday Australians paying more for groceries. You've had the ongoing debate or news about farmers potentially getting ripped off by the duopoly of the supermarket world. And so, okay, as we start to ask these questions about attribution of responsibility, there's a few red flags popping up right now. And I think once you see those red flags and you realise, okay, we're in the red here, there is a pretty serious attribution of responsibility against our brand right now. Well, what's the most appropriate strategy based on those findings of that attribution of responsibility model? And in this case, without going through it step by step with their media team, I think you'd be looking at, okay, to resolve this, a couple of hot takes from our CEO perhaps isn't going to do it. We're going to have to start to rebuild brand and trust in Woolworths. Who is the most appropriate person from our leadership team who's a trained spokespeople who can hit that demeanour that we're looking for, who can connect with customers on the issues that they're currently facing, who can acknowledge that attribution of responsibility that we think they've placed on us right now for helping them get through this cost of living crisis and this current media context. Okay, is there someone in our team who fits that strategy a little bit better? Because in this case, and we've seen a few commentators discuss this over the past week, yes, the message is important and how you technically respond to some of those questions and the content of your response is important, but your demeanour and your connections to customers in this circumstance are just as important. And I think that all comes from that attribution of responsibility and understanding that current media cycle and the current thoughts and feelings of your customers.
Yeah. And just to add to that as well, I thought it was really interesting. Like, I feel like if you're approaching an interview like this and you were like, I know that I want to get the CEOs of both these organizations in a room and interview them, I imagine if they'd locked in the Coles CEO, they would have gone to Woolworths and said, we've already got Leah Weckert ready to go and we're going to interview her. And I think that has to come into play if you're a media advisor. If they're bringing out, to use a very colloquial term, a big dog like that, Woolworths are going to have to bring out someone equal. I think otherwise, if I was watching it at home, I would think, why has this person been wheeled out and they've brought out the Coles CEO? It just doesn't seem like a level playing field.
And it's also to realise in those positions that their stakeholders aren't just their customers. They are their employees and employers and contractors and wholesalers as well. Yeah, you aren't just talking to hopefully make more money for your company. You're actually trying to keep your employees happy or explain why their conditions are tough and that you will try and work better for them as well. So, yeah, I think Brad missed many opportunities. And it resulted in his resignation that same week. And so in terms of rebuilding trust now, I suppose, the social license of Woolworths, but I think trust in this situation is a bit of a terminology for it. How does Woolworths go about that? And I suppose my question here is really on a perspective and lens. So you've made a mistake, you have to acknowledge the mistakes, and they haven't really done that in the last 12 months across all the incidents you just described before. You have a new CEO coming up. Is your focus forward focus? Is it backwards focus? Is it split? And if you do split, like how do you split it between apologising or reconciling the mistakes you've made previously and then trying to sell and I suppose promote the new Woolworths future that you're trying to create?
I would always lean to encouraging teams to take responsibility wherever possible. And there is so much data out there that backs that up. So many reviews of past apologies and organisation responses to issues or organisational responses to poor brand sentiment or trust sentiment. And they all point to the same thing, like organisations that acknowledge failures, take responsibility for failures and show empathy for the impact of those failures on their customers and their stakeholders. If they do that and then show a path for how they're going to make that better going into the future, they bounce back so much quicker than others. You cannot argue with the data. It just backs that up. So in this circumstance, I'd be encouraging Woolworths to think about how can we take responsibility for this current lack of trust or lack of confidence in our brand. How can we acknowledge perhaps some of the failures then, even if technically we haven't done anything wrong? And I go back to that attribution responsibility, doesn't matter. The fact is everyday Australians are doing it tough and they want to see you do your part to make their life a little bit better. So I'd be encouraging Woolworths to take that on or show empathy by acknowledging the difficulties that Australians are going through right now and to play their part in showing a pathway for how they're going to make that better going forward.
Yeah, and I think like the Australia Day, like with taking the merchandise away on Australia Day and the subsequent backlash from that clearly showed they weren't doing community consultations properly, or they weren't consulting community at the scale of which they need to actually understand what community sentiment is around their brand, around supermarkets in general, about cost of living. So I think if you can show that you're actually engaging with community and listening to their concerns, and people saying, I can't afford to buy dinner for my family this week, actually listen to them. That's a huge part of this as well, is actually listening and going, okay, we're going to create a plan where we can listen and act on what people give, what the feedback we get. So I think community consultation is a massive one. You can't just sort of fix the way you respond to media inquiries and what your public statements are going out. You need to actually show that you're working with the communities that are buying from you. You need to show that you're actually working with the suppliers, the farmers, whose entire incomes rely on their trade with you. So you need to make sure that you're actually going out to communities, understanding their grievances and actually working on them. Otherwise, it's all kind of just words and no action.
I suspect Woolies are probably doing a lot of those things. You know, they probably are doing a lot of amazing things in our community. I'm confident they are. Mm. And there'd be a lot of people, a lot of Woolies staff right now who are probably seeing the hits on their brand off the back of this one interview on ABC and being like, well, that's not fair. We are doing these amazing things that, you know, you can't associate your entire interpretation of our brand and how good we are based on one interview with the CEO that went off track. But unfortunately, that's what happens. Like customers, I don't think about Woolies every day, despite shopping there regularly. I don't think about them every day. All I see is the one interview on ABC, and we make judgments based on that, which is unfortunate. You know, it makes it really hard and volatile for brands to keep that strong reputation and to make people understand or see all the amazing things that you do. And I think, you know, I don't have an answer to that challenge, but as communicators and media advisors going forward, we have to think like, how do we get cut through? Like, our customers are receiving information about our brand all over the place. And a lot of the time it's not going to be great because, you know, it might be competitors or it might be people who think we're doing the wrong thing. How do we get information about all the amazing things that we are doing cut through in that storm of information? And that is a really difficult thing for communicators and media advisors to figure out, and something that's going to be a big challenge, I think, going forward in this sort of cyclone of information that hits customers every day.
And something they'll really have to focus on, because there's, I think, 6 different inquiries out at the moment about the duopoly that Coles and Woolies share and how that's unfolded and whether we need to change our competition laws in Australia and also our land laws as well, about how they can like land block and buy land in advance and then open a new supermarket. So it'll be interesting. They're going to have an entirely new strategy, I think, once those findings come out from those inquiries as well. Yeah.
And I think the big learning, if we can take something away from this interview or this recent media engagement, is through all those inquiries and through finding that way to get their cut through with their key messages, it's got to come down to humility and understanding of what your customers are currently going through. And if nothing else, focus on that. So if there's a pathway forward for Woolies and others and Coles, it's that humility angle and not coming across as if you're above questioning, because that will always backfire. And even if technically you've done nothing wrong, just think about that attribution responsibility. Our customers are doing it tough. Let's connect with them. Let's be humble and let's work through these inquiries and let's work through the amazing things that we are doing by way of painting a path forward.
Well, I'm glad we didn't have to have a walkout in this interview process today, but we will have to leave it there, of course. That's all we have time for. Thank you, Tilly and James, for your time, and thank you everyone who's been watching and listening. And make sure you subscribe to What's at Stake on your platform of choice or on YouTube. And if you have a topic or theme that you'd like us to cover, let us know by leaving a comment or review. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.